Again, welcome to our series on the grand story, a story that we believe provides a unique view of God, a unique view of the world, and a unique view of existence. And the next presentation we have simply called Surprised by Hope. Now, the stories or the values from paradise is now in a free fall. And it all began with the temptation story, which we have encountered. It was a temptation to seek independence from God. It was a temptation to master the values that forms our lives. Now, a philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher, he had a very, very sharp eye to the deepest human drive or passion, and he called it the will to power, or Wille zur Macht. Sounds better for German almost. Today we consider the human will to power or independence or for mastery of our own destiny or our will to determine the values in which we live our lives. We actually see this as something good. We find it natural, and we find it to be a good expression of the human spirit or the human self. Actually, we now see all of this as a natural expression of the human spirit and the human self. Yes, we even think it is very good. But when we turn to the biblical story, we get another view. This is exactly what is wrong with the human spirit when we look at the biblical beginning story. So let's try to sum up again what this story is all about. Humans fell for temptation of the serpent power. This is the first thing. The temptation began with a temptation to master our own destiny. This is what is promised. It was a temptation to be the setters of the values in our own life. We can distinguish between what is good and evil. And it was a temptation to be independent of God. It simply declared, you are God's. You don't need dependency of God. In other words, it is independence from the idea that God is our cosmic life support system. So this is what the temptation story is all about. Now we read that this act not only led to the loss of the human privileged position to manage nature. We have already seen that. But even worse, it actually led to humans losing their privileged position in relationship to God. So the temptation story ends with what we have already seen, the great exclusion from God, from life, from paradise, no direct access to God anymore. They lost the rights to an unrestricted communion with God. This is fatal. So humans' existence is now seen as being in a state of emergency. And paradise life is on pause, according to the logic of the story so far. Now the great surprise in that story is that God does not leave the world to self-destruction. He could have done that, but he initiates what we would call a rescue plan. And this is what we are going to see unfold in the subsequent events. The promise sounds like this. And we go back. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. This is a promise. Actually, it's more than that. It's a declaration of war against the mysterious serpent power, whoever that is, that has invaded the world and who has deceived humanity. The war will unfold in the human arena, as we see. It's a conflict over the values of good and evil. In other words, the human or the world will become a conflict zone And it will be a battle for hearts and minds. This is what we basically hear here. But it also promises that God will eventually defeat this evil force in a complete victory. A victory that will undo the damage and thus restore the lost paradise life. This is the implication. The victory will be achieved by a divine agent, which will manage the conflict and seek to empower the human agent so that they can resist the evil force that is now playing havoc in this world. However, the promise does not reveal exactly how, or when, or where, or by whom the serpent power will be defeated. Or whether it's going to be achieved in a single future event, or whether it's going to happen in stages. Nevertheless, the story makes it very, very clear that God will engage in drastic damage control and remedial, should I say, redemptive actions, measures that will be further expanded in what we call the Noah story and will be further expanded in what we call the Moses story, but that's for the future. Measures that will eventually be obsolete and disappear when paradise life returns. That's the logic of it. None of these measures are permanent. They are temporary. So the divine declaration or war or the divine conflict in the human arena introduces a new, unique philosophy of history. It's a view of history involved here that flies in the face of all ancient and modern deterministic philosophies of history. And I have in mind here especially the idea of inevitable human progress that was formulated by the German philosopher Hegel for about 200 years ago. We are all Hegelians, as I read in a recent newspaper article. Meaning that we all think and look at history through his glasses. Hegel believed that the human spirit, or even more correctly, the world spirit, tended towards goodness. And that conflicts in the human arena actually were the means by which the human spirit would be moved forward and thus drive human cultural evolution. Now, the biblical beginning story, as we can see, they are holding a radically different view. Here there is a cosmic battle over the values of good and evil, yes, but the outcome of that battle is guaranteed by God and God alone, and not by the human spirit. So God is the one driving the story forwards. It's not the human spirit that drives it forwards. So let's take a closer look at how this human conflict or battle of hearts and minds are going to play out in the subsequent biblical story. Now, God gave humanity a mandate to populate the world, we read. And here it is. God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. That's before the temptation story. The crisis in paradise does not seem to, should I say, suspend this plan, nor does the conflict that follows seem to suspend that plan. Now, let me put a footnote here regarding this multiply and be fruitful. There are often many negative views around regarding sex, as if God is, as if it's something evil. Now, let's just note that God invented sex according to this story and blessed it. So irrespective of what humans have done in managing this power, the powers are not in themselves evil or sinful or unworthy of human dignity. The negative views have come from elsewhere. So we read, now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Cain and Abel may, according to this story, be the first or the only ones, the first ones, but certainly not the only ones. Even the last ones that are coming on the scene. In the story, they are only the beginning of a long chain of children and grandchildren, according to the narrative. However, the human story zooms in on the Abel and Cain stories precisely because they are key persons in the emerging conflict with over the values of good and evil that will be played out in what we could call the human theater. How big the family were according to the story, how old they were when that conflict broke out, the story does not tell. It simply says like this: in the course of time, that could be any time, it could be anywhere in the flow of time, we don't know when. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel for his part brought the firstlings of his flock. Now, obviously what we are listening to here is worship. It's about God. It's about our relationship to God. They are approaching God. They want to impress God or whatever it is. For we read, the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. How God signals, according to the story, we still operate within the story, how God would signal his approval or disapproval, the story doesn't tell. It's up for you to guess. And why God rejects Cain's worship and approves of Abel's worship, the story does not tell. So we often guess, and I've heard many guesses regarding this based on later worship practices, and concludes that Cain simply provided the wrong sacrifice. That may very well be the case. We do not know. The text does not tell us. Actually, the Israelite worship contained both blood and grain sacrifices. And the key words used here in this first story about sacrifices or worship are exactly the same words that are later on used in the Israelite sanctuary services. So what is wrong with Cain's worship? After all, we should remember that an acceptable worship to God is not just a matter of the form of worship, but also concerns the attitude of the worshipper. You'll learn about that later on in the story. And that is the focus of the text we are reading. God simply asked him, what is the matter with you, Cain? Why are you angry? And why are your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. It desires for you, but you must master it. In other words, God is confronting Cain according to the story and says, your state of mind is evil. And this is the first time we encounter a word for sin. But it's not the last time we are going to encounter that word for sin. But it is used as a designation of the state of mind in which Cain is now living or being. Now, Cain can still choose whether or not this state of mind shall rule over him or not. This is very clear. And the cryptic statement in the temptation story may actually be the key to understand why he had a choice. Here God promised that somehow he would empower humans to be able to resist the serpent power. So God says to Cain, the choice is yours. You can choose what path you will follow. But as we read the story about Cain, to make a long story short, we know that he never relented of his anger. Actually, he ended up killing his brother. And so God spoke to Cain again and made it clear what he really thinks about murder and violence. But Cain regrets nothing. Instead, he begins to complain about the punishment, saying, It's not fair. For we read, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. So we see a man that is still very angry. And he sees himself as the victim of a miscarriage of justice on the part of God. It's really not that a big deal to kill his brother. Thus we read, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now, I think the real significance of that story and this event is that this tragedy here, this struggle between Cain and Abel, will actually end up dividing humankind, according to the story, for the first time in two parallel groups. Those who call on the Lord versus those who leave the Lord. And Cain becomes the father of a generation of very violent people, as the story goes, which will develop a culture of systematic violence and revenge. And we hear about a fifth generation descendant of Cain who lived according to the philosophy of Cain. He was driven by anger, violence, and revenge, as we read in the story. Lamech said to his wives, this is a big bracket now, and notice what he's bragging about. Ada and Silla, hear my voice. I have killed a man for wounding me, and a young man for striking me. If Cain was avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-folds. Some of you may notice that later on when Peter asked Jesus, how often should I forgive my brother when he sinned against me? And Jesus said 77-fold. Now, violence is apparently the pride of this descendant of Cain, and he doesn't hesitate to refer, should I say, to his great-great-great-grandfather Cain as a justification for his behavior. This is his pride, and the story appears to be illustrating the kind of culture that will flourish among Cain's descendants. A culture of violence that is so scary that you actually read at the end of this story, at that time people began to invoke the name of the Lord. In other words, there is a revival, at least among some who experience this kind of violent culture. But does it last? According to the story, it does not last. For we read as the heading for the subsequent story, which we are now going to focus on, when people began to multiply on the face of the ground. Now, after this introduction, there will be a story, a scary story. And we are introduced to a story about a culture that is going to outlive, should I say, the philosophy of Lamech. And that will lead to a social catastrophe. And for the first time, we hear God's diagnosis of what is wrong with the human heart and mind. We haven't heard that before, but here it is. We read, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts were evil continually. So, the majority appear to be following the path of Cain and Lamech, and they live out their philosophy of life, which is a violent and revengeful, angry culture. Very much so. Now God says further, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. So what you hear here is the rationale for what God now is going to do. Now he's going to do something very drastic in the story, and here's the rationale: violence. So here's the rationale for why God will eventually pull the cosmic emergency brake. Because human social thinking and behavior is bent on violence and brutality on a universal scale, turning life on this planet into hell on earth. Now, this is a description of human evil that reminds us of some of the atrocities we have seen in the 20th centuries. The genocides, the holocausts, the wars of extermination that has been fought. Now, and which could only be brought to an end by use of considerable force. This is the first time that the narrative zooms in on the characteristics of the human mind subsequent to the temptation and fall story. So the big question is, and it concerns the human inclination subsequent to the temptation, subsequent to their yielding to this temptation to become the masters of their own life. To independence from God, to be the one who sets the values of what is good and evil. The question is the natural human bent towards good or evil? That's the question that we will eventually have to ask here. Now, the divisive question has been debated since antiquity. But God's diagnosis on this issue and what he has to say about it is quite clear as daylight. Because at the end of the story we read, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. That is God's diagnosis. And that probably explains why God is seen as taking very strong restraining measures against this phenomena. In order to preserve humanity from self-destructing. This diagnosis, however, also flies in the face of our present popular enlightenment view that we have inherited from philosophers like Rousseau and others who told us that humans are essentially good. They told us our natural inclination tends towards the goodness. So did the philosopher Hegel. Our natural bend or inclination is towards the good. That we are okay as we are. We often say that to each other. Just accept yourself as you are. You're okay as you are. Love yourself. Be glad about yourself. There's nothing wrong with you. And if anything evil turns out in your life, it is some bad circumstances in the past of your life. So, our culture believes in the natural goodness of man. I'll just remind you that the kind of answer you give to this question will determine whether you see any light in the biblical remedy for the problem or you don't. So at the time of Noah, God is seen as losing the battle for the hearts and the minds. This is what the story reveals. There is only Noah and his family left. And we may say often, and we guess and say, that's because most have lost their faith. In other words, but that may not be the case. They may have been killed for their faith. The world is very, very vicious and violence, and they are easy picks and victims for violent culture. After all, Abel was killed for his faith by an angry brother. Why should he be the last in the storyline? So what is left, whatever the reason, is Noah and his family. As we read, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. So Noah was not following the path of evil and violence of the generation of Cain and Lamech. And it seems as if the secret of his positive life was that he walked with God. That is, he maintained a continual communion with God. This is the secret recipe. This apparently is the simple recipe for following the path of goodness, for living out God's values. This is actually the second time this recipe is given, and reflects God's promise that he would empower humans to resist if they so wished. Cain was given the same option as we have read, but he refused, and so did the large majority of his descendants at the time of Noah. Now, human culture was now in a state of total meltdown or crisis. The great surprise is not that God pulls the cosmic emergency brake, but that he orchestrates a grand rescue mission. Why make an effort to save humanity? That is the real surprise in the story. And this is a surprise that really calls for a very good explanation. And that is what the Noah story is all about. So our next presentation will be called Beyond Catastrophe.